and I'm going to get started. We've got a lecture today on Alfred Stieglitz, who's one of my favorite photographers. And can you guys all see that? Stieglitz up on the screen?
Yes, up.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So Alfred Stieglitz is an American photographer born to German Jewish immigrants in Hoboken, New Jersey. And he's probably the single most important photographer in American history for a number of reasons, none of which, well, we'll cover some of them today, but it doesn't exclude his photography, which is also spectacular. Was a spectacular photographer at a time when photography was incredibly difficult, but he also is probably this person single-handedly most responsible for bringing photography into the United States as in acceptance as an art form. That before Stieglitz's work, photography was thought of as recording medium, kind of like a machine, rather than an art form. And he single-handedly changed that perception, not just by his work, but by a whole bunch of things that we'll discuss today. Up on the screen in front of you, you can see there's a image of Stieglitz by Gertrude Casper, who's another American photographer who he supported and gave shows to. And it's a fascinating piece of work because it's a combination of darkroom manipulation. You can see how the image has been modified in the background, and then a very beautiful rendition of Stieglitz in incredible tonal range. And on the right is not a really great print or a great example of a print, but it's a self-portrait that Stieglitz does using a view camera, a large view camera, which is what he started out with, which is pretty typical for the 1800s, that people had large negatives or glass plates that they worked with, and the cameras were bulky and slow and required a tripod. We'll talk more about the technical issues.
Harry, did you notice that he has a gun in his hand?
Yeah, he's got a gun in his hand. I don't know why. That's a good observation, and I'm wondering what that's for. That's a very good question, because I've never seen any explanation for the gun. So anyway, Hoboken in 1860s was like a lot of places on the coast, lots and lots of immigrants, lots of industry, lots of jobs. And his father came here to work at his brother's business. His father was a very highly educated, sophisticated man, as was his mother, and they were both immigrants from Germany. And Germany at the time, interestingly enough, was one of the most progressive places in the world. And he came here not because he didn't like the situation. He came here because the job opportunities were so good. And it's actually ironic that later Stieglitz is sent back. They moved back for a while to Europe, and then Stieglitz ends up staying there, coming back, and then he goes back to Germany because his father sent him there because there was a lot of anti-Semitic discrimination in the United States at the time, and there was almost very, very little in Germany. And the opportunities were better for him there in terms of education as well. So he spends a year in high school in Germany, and then he spends about 8 years in Berlin studying first mechanical engineering and then photography. And his father had been in the Union Army, but he was also a wool trader. And his father was a very canny businessman and managed to corner the market on wool and made something like $5 million in today's money in the middle 1800s, and retired early at about 43 and used the money the rest of his life. He supported artists, he supported his family. He basically bankrolled most of Alfred's business ventures and commercial ventures and artistic ventures, which enabled him to live the way that he did. So he goes to Berlin for about 8 years. His father sends him to study mechanical engineering, which he has no interest in whatsoever. But in 1893, or excuse me, that's wrong, it's 1883. He lucks into lecture about the photography, the beginnings of photography and chemistry, and ends up working with a genius, a German chemical engineer who's perfecting chemical processes, and ends up studying photography and ends up becoming a photographer while he's there and learning the highest level of printing techniques and everything that to know literally about photography at the time. So he's a spectacular technician to begin with. And this is Vogel, who was his professor, who was one of the 2 or 3 most famous chemical engineers connected with photography in the world. So he has this incredible depth to his technical knowledge before he really even has any artistic training. But he does his first print that he submits to a competition for the American Photographer magazine in 1887 and wins first prize with this print called The Last Joke in Bellagio, which is a town in northern Italy. And it's fascinating because it's a beautiful technical accomplishment, but it's also a very sweet and kind of endearing scene of these poor kids. Notice nobody's got shoes, or maybe one or two kids have shoes on, around this woman who's getting water outside her apartment in Bellagio. And this is one of the things that's really interesting about Stieglitz's work, is that he has this incredible technical gift, but he also has an emotional depth in his work that's fascinating. And he goes on the next year to submit 2 more prints to American Photographer magazine, and he wins first and second place. So he's already at the beginning of his career, already breaking new ground in terms of what people thought was possible, and also in terms of what was acceptable. And he's a fascinating person in that he has this connection between technical ability and meaning and composition that is, I think, almost unparalleled. When he's in Berlin, he has 2 relationships with 2 different women. One who, well, we don't really know much about either of them. This one, her name is Paula, apparently, and he refers to her later as a prostitute, which is interesting. He may have had a child with her, but he doesn't stay. His sister dies during childbirth, and he goes back the next year to the United States. And apparently, George O'Keeffe said that he supported this woman and her child for the rest of his life. And Georgia settled all the estates, so she kind of knew what she was talking about. But this is a really strange and interesting photograph in that respect, because it's, it's portraying her writing letters by herself in this room. And if you look, I think I've got some blow-ups here. If you look on the wall, she's got these Valentines posted. And then she's got pictures of herself, one laying down in a bed, and 2 look like they're swapped side to side. And then another one down here. And then 2 prints of one of Stieglitz's image called The Coming Storm. And then this caged bird, which seems very symbolic and seems really contrived when you start looking at the fact that he's got this triangular, upside down triangular composition pointing down towards her. This image doesn't fit in this frame, so it seems like maybe it's just put in for the sake of the photograph, even though it looks somewhat naturalistic. And people have commented on the light coming through the blinds as being like the cage of the bird. It's a little hard to know. I don't know if he ever talked about it in detail. But it does have antecedents in Dutch painting, which are, when you have, this is one of Vermeer's paintings called The Love Letter. And it shows a woman who doesn't look very happy that she's just received this letter from her maid. And in the background is this ship that's sailing. Well, this is an old metaphor in Dutch painting that all kinds of painters used, where the storm at sea or the shipwreck or something is a metaphor for what's going on in their personal life. And this was, of course, in the Dutch world, very logical because the Dutch were international traders and their fortunes often rode on the survival or the destruction of a ship that was bearing cargo on which they had bought thousands of dollars in our money of stock in companies that could lose a fortune. And as a result, I think you can probably read into this because this seems so artificially contrived that this is really Stieglitz's, his own decision to include this. So it has sort of a subliminal message, which you almost don't see. You don't see unless you really look closely at the photographs. Yeah, but I think it does make a lot of sense. And then, so he goes back in 1890, goes back to New York, and his sister has died in childbirth, and he's really kind of distraught because New York of the 1890s was not very civilized. There were, I don't think, any big museums at the time. It was rough and ready. It was an industrial place. He seemed like he was quite disturbed and very unhappy for quite a while. But at any rate, he does discover something that's very important, which is the handheld camera. And so he buys a 4x5 camera. 4x5 is the 4x5 inches is the size of the actual negative or plate. And this is about a quarter the size of an 8x10, which, so it weighs a lot less. You can carry it around, and you can make exposures on the street as long as there's enough light without a tripod, which is kind of revolutionary. And so he takes this image, he loves this image, he reprints it over and over many times over the years, and he actually dodges and burns, which means that you, when you're making the image, you take your hand and you cover up an area while you're making the print so that these railroad ties or logs that are put down here, these pieces of wood, which were platforms for putting stuff on when they took it off of wagons. It's gone here. He's gotten rid of it. And you'll also notice, and this is the earlier print. This is the later print. And you'll also notice that he's chosen to include a lot of details on the side, which aren't really, in terms of the aesthetic of 1892, this is a much more painterly aesthetic. You include exactly what you want to have, and you delete everything else. And that's the way painters compose compositions. Well, the snapshot or the modern photograph isn't that contrived. It tends to be much more inclusive of a lot of, and this is, we're talking in a general sense, not everybody, of course, everybody, there's a million different possibilities. But this very formally composed composition is what painters were trained to do. People who took snapshots, people who work in a later aesthetic, more modernist aesthetic, tend to do a lot of work that's not as contrived, though there are plenty of contrived things going on even in the modern period right now. This is one of his most famous pieces. I just love this image. It's called The Terminal. And the streetcars back then were pulled by horses before there were internal combustion engines. And so they're cleaning the horses after their run, and you can see the steam and the smoke coming off the backs of the sweating horses. And this is at the end of the line, so they turn around, the track makes a sharp curve and goes back down. I think it's Fifth Avenue. But at any rate, you can see what he's done here in terms of the manipulation of it, of making this foreground horse and this guy really dark, and some of the areas here really dark. So it heightens the contrast on the backs of the horses to an almost pure white to pure black relationship, which makes it, of course, much more dramatic and much more interesting than a lot of other photographs. And this is the kind of thing that really superb photographers really had done ever since the 1870s or 1880s. But he's a master at it. His printing technique is second to none. As I said, he was trained for years with one of the best photochemists in the world. This is another one of his works, and I haven't been able to find anything on this. I just I think this is, it's not famous, but I found it in a book on Stieglitz, and if anybody knows what it is, I'd love to hear, but I wasn't able to identify it. Same dramatic kind of contrast here between the horses and the snowy background, but not nearly as compositionally tricky as the previous one. And then in 1893, he marries Emily Obermeyer, who's a daughter of a very, very wealthy family. And they don't get along from the beginning. One of the stories I read was that they went out on a date or something, and her brother apparently was with them as a chaperone. On the way home, she fell asleep in the car and put her head on Alfred's shoulder, which apparently compromised her character. And so he married her and almost never seemed to cease to regret the decision. She apparently was very prudish. Apparently they didn't have sex for a year. She didn't care much for art. She wasn't really interested in museums. I don't think she was interested in photography. Apparently what she liked was really fancy clothes and really expensive shopping trips. And it was a poor match. And they have a daughter, Kitty, who's born in 1898, who later has psychological problems and institutionalized. So he said something about marrying her, not so much because she had money, but because he didn't have to support her, that he didn't want to have to support a woman. And he was really wedded to his photography and what he was interested in doing. I think the photograph shows a little bit of distance there. Okay, let's go on next. Whoops. So they go on a trip to Europe, and he spends all of his time going around and meeting with photographers and people that he had known in Germany and other places and taking photographs. And she spends most of the time by herself shopping and being in expensive hotels and restaurants. And he does some of these prints that he continues to use the rest of his life. This is one of his. And you notice it's still a little bit composed the way a painting would be composed. It's a triangular figure, pyramidal composition like Da Vinci used, in fact. It's got a soft tonal range. It's not as hard tonally as a lot of his other work, but it's essentially a romantic vision of peasant life. And this is the kind of thing that other photographers were doing and painters had been doing since the 1850s. Right? We have Millet's Gleaners, and the Gleaners were the poor people who went around and lived off the stubble that was left in the fields after everything had been harvested. And Stieglitz is very influenced by European painting of the 1800s. And this influence, I think, carries over in his photography for quite a while. You'll notice the sense of isolation of the figure against the sky. With Millet's, we've got the isolation of the figures by use of a strong tonal contrast versus the more kind of pastel background. And these are all devices that painters used in order to make their subjects stand out. And of course, the basic idea is romanticizing the peasant life, trying to create a world, an ideal world, which is essentially on its way out because of industrialization. And so he gets involved with the Camera Club of New York. And this is a big deal because the Camera Club isn't just people sitting around. It's a big organization with hundreds of members. They have their own dark room, their own meeting rooms, their own exhibition space. And at the same time, his father buys a half interest in a company that does polychrome printing. And on the right, you can see an example of that they developed some processes to do prints. And the colors they only had certain dyes that worked, and they only had certain things they could do. It isn't like a modern color panchromatic process where everything can be colored exactly the way it looks, but it was a step towards it. And so he becomes the owner of Polychrome at the same time that he gets involved with the Camera Club. And the Camera Club's a big club, a lot of members, a lot of people with clout, and it's very political, but he gets very, very heavily involved in it. He edits the Camera Club notes and then helps to manage a joining of the Camera Club and another photography association into an even bigger group. And they put him in charge of Camera Work, which is their new quarterly that comes out. And he does this without a salary. He ends up financing most of it out of his allowance, which I think I read somewhere was something in today's dollars like $30,000 a month. It was very healthy. He had a very healthy allowance from his father. And his other brothers were all successful. They were doctors and physicians and PhDs in engineering. He's the only one who never seems to kind of cut the cord. He's always doing work for free. He's always spending his own money on things. And fortunately, his father was well able to afford this, because even though his father had retired at 43, he had so much money that he never ran out, apparently. He travels back and forth to Europe a number of times, sees various exhibitions in Vienna, Germany, Paris, and goes to shows of modern, really modern art. This is Gustav Klimt on the left, The Kiss, a terrific piece of Vienna Secessionist work. On the right is a whole bunch of typefaces designed by various Viennese artists. And there's a whole bunch of new things happening in Europe. And this is really exciting for Alfred, because he's just as connected with Germany and with European art as he is with American art at the time, perhaps more so. And so he meets this a French photographer named Robert Demaki, and who does work like the 1898 print called Rouen on the right, which is a city in France. And you can see how it's still a little bit painterly. It still has a lot of atmospheric effects, but the composition is super strong. The angles are really interesting. There is a sense of realism about the work that will become part of what we'll call later straight photography. That is very important. And Demaki's a good friend of his for the rest of his life, and I think terrifically influential. He also shows Demaki's work in his gallery when he starts that up. So he breaks with the Photo Club in 1902 and starts his own group called the Photo Secession. And the Photo Secession is based on the Vienna Secession idea that modern photography should be different. It should be something new. And in some ways, he's struggling with what that is, but he's really trying to promote this idea that we're not going to go back to doing things the way that painters did it in the 1800s, which was called pictorialism. And pictorialism was the movement in photography. And he's still connected with that at the same time he's trying to break away. And he does this image on the right, which is rain in Paris. And it's a terrific kind of simplification of a rainstorm and the light and dark energy that you see in that kind of environment. But it's still got this softness, it's still got this pictorial quality about it, which is really tied up with an 1800s aesthetic. And so even though he's doing work that he wants to be different, he hasn't made the break yet. This is the print I showed earlier by Gertrude Caspier. And Caspier, as I mentioned, I think she was from Des Moines, Iowa, but she had traveled in Europe and really was a spectacular photographer who he shows quite a bit in his gallery. Well, anyway, he's already very involved in his publication of camera work, I should say, was the highest quality publication of photography that had ever happened in the United States. It may still be the highest quality because they didn't just make copies of the photographs. They made photogravures, or photo etchings, essentially. So they take a negative and project it onto a copper plate, and with photographic sensitive material, photosensitive material on the plate. Then they develop it in acid, and the acid would bite through, so it ends up looking like an intaglio. It looks like an intaglio print, and they would print it by hand. So they would hand rub the ink into the surface, and then they'd hand wipe it off, and then they'd print one image at a time. And the images were so good that in one of the shows that was sent to Europe, the photographs themselves failed to show up, but they had photographers of them, and they thought they were the originals, and they went ahead and hung those. And these things are still amazingly valuable because of the quality. Well, anyway, he's the whole time he's doing this, he's not just editing, he's writing things, he's networking, he knows all the people in all the museums, and he gets the Met in 1902 to sponsor a show that goes to Italy of his artists from camera work. And the King of Italy comes and gives it the grand prize. He gives the Americans a grand prize. It's on the map. And he had an agreement with the curator at the Met that when it came back, the photographs would go into the permanent collection, which would have been the first museum collection in the United States of photography. Well, unfortunately, the guy dies before the show comes back, and nothing's written, so it doesn't happen at the time. But this is the kind of thing that Stieglitz was trying to do to promote the idea that photography was truly a fine art. It wasn't just a way of recording. He does lots of shots of New York, famous as a photographer of the city. The Flatiron Building, very famous. Almost everybody's done a picture of that. He promotes a lot of artists, a number of them women. He's very supportive of a whole bunch of people. This is, I mentioned Gertrude Casper's work, 1903, Blessed Art Thou Among Women, and she specializes in pictures of women with their children. And this one ends up being very famous. It's literally in every photo book you'll ever see. And it's got some hard edge qualities, but it's still rooted in that very kind of sweet 1800s aesthetic, but not quite as gauzy and soft focus as a lot. And then he meets Edward Steichen. And Steichen is in many ways the key to what Stieglitz becomes, I think. And they become very, very good friends for a long time until the war, and we'll talk about that. But this is one of his polychrome prints. This is printed with color added to it. Would have been a black and white image originally. But at any rate, you can see what he's doing here is something that almost looks like modern art. It's so reductive. The foreground is so undefined. The repeating of the patterns and it's split almost perfectly into a three-level composition. And if you know your rule of thirds, that's one of the ways you make things interesting, is put things on those levels so that there's a separation. It kind of develops an architectonic quality to the work that just a row of trees wouldn't have. And we'll talk about Steichen some more. As I said, Damaki continues to work with him. He continues to show his work. This is a nude that he does, and then does heavy manipulation on the background using developing chemicals, kind of like Gertrude's study of Stieglitz did. And so you can see they're moving kind of back and forth between this more realistic aesthetic and something that's more painterly.
Names I've never heard.
This is Prescott Adamson, who's one of the many photographers he supports and shows quite a bit of. Particularly important, I think, in 1904, because in some ways he's getting much closer to this more modern aesthetic of what's called straight photography. He's still got some of the smoke effects of what we see, but there's no soft focus. It's really hard edge, hard focus, atmospheric effects that are actually there. He's not creating the environment, he's recording it. But of course, it still has this terrific structural sense of these large forms, what we call architectonic elements that anchor the composition, this large factory with these huge kind of roofs and smokestacks, and then this one little lone figure down here in the whole landscape. Terrific, terrific piece. And he opens his first galleries in 1905 called Little Galleries of the Photo Succession, which later turns into 291. So he's starting to also show people, not just have them in the magazine or in the journal. And in 1908, he starts what is probably the single most important gallery in the history of the United States for photography, which is 291. It was called 291. It was at 291 Fifth Avenue. And it's not a huge gallery, but it's big enough. And it becomes highly regarded as the center of photography in the United States. And he gets to know all the critics in New York. He knows all the museum people. He knows a lot of wealthy industrialists. Has a lot of people come through and buy the work, hundreds and hundreds of people a month. Later, it gets to thousands of people a month come and see the shows. And he does this by promoting things in camera work, but also by writing articles in newspapers. He's really a genius at promotion. And the thing that's amazing about Stieglitz is that he didn't make any money on it. He lived on his own money. He spent his own money. And he paid the artists either everything that they made from selling or everything except 15%, which he used for the expense. And so he's really doing this out of the goodness of his heart and the fact that he's just simply driven to make photography a viable art form. And many artists he supports for years. He's incredibly generous. This is a photographer I don't know anything about, Puyo, but I do just love this image. This is one that he had in the show of Sacré-Cœur up here. You could just barely see it as this maid is looking out over the park or the street below from one of these fancy apartments leading up to Montmartre. But it's, I just love that image.
So that's all manipulation.
This is probably his most famous image called the Steerage. And he takes it, I think when I first heard about this, the story was that these were immigrants going to New York. Well, it isn't actually. The story is actually that these are people going back from New York. And they may have been going back to visit relatives, and they may have been going back because they didn't get in, and we simply don't know. But at any rate, when Stieglitz wrote about it and talked about it, he didn't talk about the social issue at all. He was talking about how he loved this diagonal here and intersecting with this diagonal here, and this terrific plank going across that kind of separates it into two tiers. He really was a formalist, and he was really in love with the formal elements of the print. Of course, it's one of the most famous prints in the world now. But it's fascinating because, as it was with the Bellagio, The Last Joke, it's this beautiful piece of work that's rooted in terrific technical ability and terrific composition that also has this great emotional resonance. And it seems as if he was almost totally, you know, that wasn't the issue for him, but it works, right? And so he's a very strange, interesting person that way. And it could be just that he didn't normally feel comfortable talking about those things. He also experiments with polychrome prints. This is one of a writer, Frank Eugene, who's a friend of his and stays a friend for many, many years. And you can see how they're trying to get the colors right. It's hard to do, it's hard to control. And what they do is they essentially do what they used to do in printing until digital came out, which is that if you want a really great color print, you make color separation negatives. And if you want an amazing print, you make 9. Well, they made, I think, 4 color separation negatives and then printed it using each one with different chemistry to try to make. But these are very laborious, they're very expensive. And as a result, color printing doesn't really take off for quite a while. Another terrific piece, I think, is Joseph Kiley, a bit of Paris from 1907. And this, he's not well known at all, but I just think it's a spectacular piece of work. I love how the boulevards here are like these black beams running through the composition, and you're juxtaposing this terrific sense of formal solidity here with this very soft kind of vaporous detail here in the houses. And then in the top of the photograph is almost white. There's just this kind of dark gray here and these medium grays here, but it's all vapor. And so you're contrasting the lower part, which is a terrific composition in itself, with a totally different kind of top half of the image. And I just think it's quite brilliant. Apparently Stieglitz did too. And then he starts changing, and he gets a lot of flack from the camera club because of this, but he's not only the editor, but he essentially pays for it. Because he starts bringing in artists, painters, not photographers. And the August issue in 1912 is totally devoted to the work of Matisse and Picasso. And he's also had shows in his gallery of Rodin and Cézanne's work. And so he's really reaching outside of the photography genre, and he's not even showing Americans, he's showing Europeans. But these are the most avant-garde of Europeans at the time. And you know, these shows he had did not sell well. I think the Picasso show sold one piece for $12. And this is well before these people are recognized and acceptable. And so he's 20 years ahead of the game. This is the Armory Show. The Armory Show was organized by three friends of his. He didn't really organize it, but they put him on the list of co-presidents of it because he had a big name and they wanted his support. And Monet and a couple of other artists, I think Max Weber, were also on that list of co-presidents. But he doesn't really do much for it, but he was so instrumental in getting Picasso and Matisse and Renoir and these other people known to Americans that he was really a seminal figure who made this even possible, that these three guys would risk the money. And the show ends up being an enormous success. He writes a number of things promoting it in the papers, and he ends up getting a lot of compliments that he didn't really deserve because he didn't actually do anything for the show. But he got the ground laid by getting people familiar with the artists from Europe. And the artists, two-thirds of the art in the show were actually American artists. And the show was organized to promote American modern art. But the third, almost all of the sales happened to the European art, which was the third of the show. Americans sold hardly anything. So it was in a way very disappointing, but it was a watershed event because it was the first time Americans had been able to see most of these European modernists. He gets to know Marsden Hartley, American painter who works in Germany. This is called Portrait of a German Officer. And remember, this is right about the beginning of the First World War. And so Prussian love of pomp and display is essentially what Hartley's about here. And Hartley ends up being very, very successful. And I think Stieglitz supports him for over 10 years, almost completely. Max Weber, he also gets involved in supporting. Max Weber is in the United States, goes back to Germany, is subsidized by Stieglitz. They have a hot and cold relationship because Max can be super deferential, almost fawning to Stieglitz when Stieglitz is helping him. Then when Stieglitz does something he doesn't like, he kind of lashes out at him. Apparently Max had a show at one of Stieglitz's galleries and didn't sell anything. And Max had put very high prices on everything and sold one piece for $500, but he wanted to sell them for $1,000. And apparently that was sort of the end. He blew up at Stieglitz, and he kept showing them, but I don't think they got along very well after that. And Steichen's work that we talked about a little bit is he's one of the people Stieglitz shows all the time. But what happens is the war puts a crimp in their relationship, because Stieglitz is very connected with Germany. He's got his ex-lover and child there. He's worried about people in Germany. He's worried about the war. Steichen had, because of Stieglitz's support, had been able to live in France and had a house outside of Paris. Well, when the Germans invade, they have to flee and leave everything to get away. And they can never get along really after that. They fall apart in 1916, 1917. But the final, the 1916 edition that Stieglitz puts together is actually dedicated entirely to Steichen's work. It's sort of a thank you and a goodbye at the same time. It's really quite bittersweet, but I guess that happens with friends. So in 1916, remember, he's still married. He meets George O'Keeffe, who's 20 years younger than he is. And she had been coming to the gallery, had been there a number of times before, but had never bothered to talk to Stieglitz when she was in New York, because she just wanted to look at the art. She really wasn't anything else. And so her friend sends a bunch of her drawings to Stieglitz, and without permission, he puts them up in a show with 2 other people. Well, she's quite furious about this, comes in and demands that he take the work down. And he says, there's no way. It's just like you having a child in the world and saying, nobody else can ever see this child. These works have to be shown. They have to be out there in the world. It's very critical. And so he leaves it up, and he gets very connected with her. And he makes a couple of photographs of her work, and very small format, and puts them in his pocket and carries around with him for a couple of years, and is pretty smitten with her, but also with her art. And that becomes sort of the main story. Duchamp and a number of artists come over during the war. Duchamp, of course, is the surrealist genius who sort of invents postmodern art 60 years before it exists. And he had done this famous piece called Fountain, which was just a urinal tipped upside down. He takes a pseudonym from R. Mutt. Well, he tries to enter it in this big show, and they refuse it. And he comes in and shows Stieglitz's work, and Stieglitz says, well, I'll put it in my show. So he puts this in the show right in front of another painting by Max Weber, I believe. But at any rate, so this is the first time that Duchamp's work is ever shown in the United States. Well, money is an issue. That his wife's fortune was connected with the brewing industry. And during the war, they start controlling foodstuff and start limiting the amount of alcohol that's in beer. So beer sales fall off like crazy. And his main sources of income, or his wife's income, falls off. So he has to close the gallery and stop producing camera work and use that money to help his family, his own family, rather than having all this outside stuff. Well, at this time, he makes friends with Paul Strand. And Paul Strand is maybe the most responsible for introducing a whole new aesthetic into photography. And Paul Strand had been given some good advice by a number of artists to just do your own work and don't try to look like everybody else's. And so he stops using the devices that all the pictorialists had used about putting Vaseline on the lens and moving your camera a little bit so the focus was soft. And he starts doing what we today would call straight photography, which is absolutely looking at what's there, arranging your composition, maybe your light, but not really greatly modifying it in terms of trying to make it look like a painting. And this is spectacularly important for the modernist photography movement and for the modernist movement. And there's other photographers in the United States and in Hungary and France that are also doing similar things. And as a result, this his connection with Paul Strand, and he shows Strand's work and supports Paul Strand as well. And Strand ends up being very, very successful. We'll talk about that in a little while. Well, Steichen goes off to war. He signs up, even though he's technically too old, but they put him in charge of the Army Air Force photography unit. And he essentially is one of the people really involved in improving the quality of aerial photography. And so he spends a number of years doing that, and actually will also be involved much later with that, with the Army Air Force. This is an interesting one. It's showing a landing strip. This is a landing strip in France that has been excavated with runways in all directions in case the wind change. And this is the kind of thing that he worked on. These are his comments down here about the size of it in the runway. So that's what he worked on. Well, in 1918, they finally actually get involved. First as friends and then as lovers. And she's in New York, they get involved, and then she goes out to New Mexico for her first trip and contracts what they think is the Spanish flu. And he's very, very worried about her. And so he sends Paul Strand out to go get her and bring her back. Well, unknown to him, Paul Strand, she was kind of infatuated with both of them. And apparently they had been exchanging letters unknown to Stieglitz. And as it so happens, apparently Paul Strand was kind of personally slow and very deliberate and not so talkative, and George O'Keeffe couldn't stand that. So at the end of this, anyway, he drives her back to New York. Stieglitz says, only come if you really want to, don't come because of me. I'm still married, I can't promise anything. Well, Stieglitz's niece has an apartment in New York she's not using, so she has a place to stay. And Stieglitz says, I will support you for a year. I will give you enough money to live on for a year if you just focus on your painting. And she had a teaching job out west, and she gives that up and comes back to try her luck as a painter. And this is a funny piece. There was always a lot of talk about her flowers being kind of symbolic of female sexuality. Well, this is a sculpture that she did after her mother died, a stone sculpture of a figure in mourning. Well, Stieglitz placed this in front of the painting and took a photograph of it, which of course is what Stieglitz is thinking about, maybe not at all what George O'Keeffe was thinking about. But I should jump back a little bit and mention that he does a whole series of photographs of her, some nude, some not. And he starts showing these photographs without publishing her name. Well, everybody figures out who it is. And it's a huge success to scandal that it gets all this press, and she becomes overnight kind of a sensation. And he shows these works in the what's called the Anderson Galleries. A friend of his had this gallery, and shows, I think he has a show of 150 works, and 50 of them are pictures of George O'Keeffe's hands or her or parts of her body. And this is an enormous thing, because here's this woman who's not a professional model, she's an artist. He's married, everybody knows they have this relationship, and it's this huge kind of tabloid scandal that really propels her to fame. And whether this was planned or not, it happens. And Stieglitz was a master of promotion, so I wouldn't be surprised. He also shows John Marin's work, who did watercolors. And another thing that Stieglitz does is, by promoting Marin's work, he promotes watercolor as a serious enterprise. And this wasn't taken seriously. This is what, people were trained to do, just to kind of play around. But he sells these works and actually ends up supporting Marin for years, and Marin becomes famous, buys a place, buys an island in Maine, and he totally changes Marin's life, and he changes the perception of watercolors. And you can see he has these very strong kind of cubist affinities too, which fits right in with what's going on in the 1910s and 20s. In 1924, his wife finally agrees to a divorce. and they marry, and he starts another gallery called the Intimate Gallery. And you can see he's taking photographs of her now that portray her more individually and less sensually, and more, I think, more as an individual, more as a powerful individual. He does a series of equivalents, which what he calls them photographs of the sky over Lake George. And he's really trying to break through to abstract painting. And these things are probably as abstract as anything that's done before the 1950s, 1940s. But they're done purely with photography. The Met wants them, but they don't want to pay for them. And he's furious about this. So he figures out a way to benefit everybody, was that he donates 10 of these in, well, not 10 of these, he donates 2 of his prints and 8 of other people's work in the names of wealthy clients. So think that the Havemeyers have bought one of these and donated to the Met. And this is typical of the kinds of things that he would do to kind of work the system so that it was for everybody's benefit. Arthur Dove, a painter who George O'Keeffe really loved, shows starting in 1914 with these kind of cubist renditions of American landscape. And Arthur Dove also is entirely supported. He had actually seen Arthur Dove's work in 1909, but Dove was kind of a modest guy, and he wanted to go back to farming. And so he kind of stops painting a lot, goes back to farming, and then I think in 1912 or 1913 comes to Stieglitz and says, I really want to try to have a year of just painting. Can you give me $500 so I can live, my wife and I can live for a year, and I can just paint? And he does. He gets the money together, which is a huge amount of money, and Doug becomes a name. He's in all of the collections. He's terrific. In 1928, he works a sale of George O'Keeffe's work to a guy who's marrying a wealthy heiress for $25,000 for 4 pieces, which would be $1 million in today's money, publicizes all this, and then they don't get married and the sale falls through. But he gets the publicity. She gets the publicity. So she's the first American, probably the first American to sell 4 paintings for $1 million, right? Essentially. And he's been saving money and putting money aside for her. And so by 1929, he has an account with $80,000 in it that she can live on the interest, which at that time would have been equivalent to $250,000 a year of income. And that, so, you know, he was incredibly generous to people he cared about. But then the market crashes. And also that same year, 1929, Museum of Modern Art opens. And he opens another gallery because the Strands, Paul and Becky Strand, get together $15,000 and give him the money to start a new gallery. And George O'Keeffe goes off to Taos for the summer, buys a Ford, doesn't tell him because she knows that he likes to control everything and she doesn't want to be controlled. So she has her own car and she can do what she wants. And then Dorothy Norman, who's an heiress to the Sears fortune, gets involved with the gallery and is there while George O'Keeffe's gone. And she's married, has a child, has a wealthy husband, but they start falling in love with each other while George O'Keeffe's gone. So this is an irritant that goes on for a long time. Well, Stieglitz and O'Keeffe are still together, even though Dorothy Norman's around in the gallery. And he starts a series of photographs of New York, of the high-rises that are going up. And they're very highly composed, very beautiful renditions of modernism, literally modernist architecture. But Paul Strand goes out west, and he's taking photographs of the pueblos and the churches in the Southwest. And he does this incredibly famous series of the Taos Church, which is an adobe building. And these photographs are so important that they revolutionize what Ansel Adams thinks about photography. And Ansel Adams says, I didn't even see the at Stieglitz's, he didn't see the photos, he saw just the negatives, but he saw what Strand was doing with these things in terms of tone range and sophistication. And he said it radically changed what I thought could be possible in a photograph. George O'Keeffe has a breakdown in 1933, perhaps connected with what's going on with her marriage, but she recovers. I think it made Stieglitz realize that he couldn't just have his affairs, and it pushes them back together, the breakdown, because he takes care of her. And then in 1938, Ansel Adams has his first solo show with Stieglitz, and so he's really promoting Adams as well. This is just another one. I think this one's so incredible, Paul Strand's work. And you can see how, if you had never seen anything like this before, it really is a revolutionary way of dealing with absolute architectonic forms, absolutely monumental forms, the way that he's got this almost black, but beautifully rendered. You look at the tone range within these black areas, it's still gorgeous. There's still amazing things going on in here. And then you look at the tone range on the edges of the building and this detail and these, and he's using a large camera, I think it was 11 by 17, very, very large negatives. Just spectacular, spectacular rendition of everything. Absolutely modernist, nothing, owes nothing really to pictorialism. And Ansel Adams, as I said, got his first big show with Stieglitz. There's a movie about Ansel Adams out there if you get a chance, take a look at it. And a bunch of interviews with him. He said when he first went into Stieglitz's, he gave Stieglitz his photos, and Stieglitz said, well, just wait, go over and sit over there. Well, there was no chair in the room. There was just a radiator. And he goes, sits on the radiator. It's too hot. He has to stand up. He says, sit down. He said, it's too hot. I can't. He said, sit down. So he sits down the radiator. Then he gets up again. And he says, I'm gonna, you know, I can't stay here. He said, no, you have to wait. These are really good images. So almost from the beginning, Ansel Adams is well received by Stieglitz. And Stieglitz actually, in a way, passes the mantle to him when he retires. And Ansel Adams is the person who gets the photography department at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art founded as well, partially with work that Stieglitz gives to him to get that started. And on the left is Moonrise Hernandez, New Mexico, which is one of my favorite images in the world. A great story about that. He's driving along and he sees the moon coming over these clouds, and he jumps out, has to set up his view camera, can't find his light meter, has to guess at the exposure, takes one picture and then the light totally goes away. So everything depends on this one negative. Well, if you look, somewhere I saw a picture of the negative. It was so thin, had so little detail that you couldn't believe you could ever print it. Well, not only this is what it looks like without a lot of dodging and burning, right? But this is what it looks like, or this is what it looks like after Ansel Adams and his incredible technique, which he was one of the few people who really rivaled Stieglitz in terms of his technical.
That's the original.
Hey, Jerry, isn't the image in the lower left the close-up that we saw from the other photographer?
I'm sorry?
Isn't the Adobe building in the lower left of Ansel Adams' photograph?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's another church, but the other one's in Taos. This is Hernandez, New Mexico. But it's very similar because it's Adobe and it has the same sloping. This is the, you can see the cross here on the church. This is the apse end of it where the altar is. So it's got a similar kind of construction, but yeah, good observation. I hadn't noticed that at all. But it has this very telltale sloping quality to the roof or to the back wall, because these walls are basically built by hand. That they put up the framework and then cover it all with adobe mud with people using their hands. So they have a very beautiful naturalistic quality. Another one of Adams. And then 1934, the Literary Club of America makes it their Christmas book, a book on Stieglitz and American photography. So he's like a superstar. And unfortunately, the 30s were also the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany and in the United States. And so he gets a lot of criticism because he's Jewish And a lot of these right wingers really don't like they don't like that he's a Jew, and they don't like that he's getting so famous. But it goes with the territory. It's the 30s, and he seems to weather it with no problem whatsoever. And George O'Keeffe is spending more and more time in New Mexico. She's gone pretty much all summer, every summer, but then they come back together in the fall and winter in New York. She's bought a house and built it up in Abiquiu. He continues to do photographs of her, and the photographs are spectacular. This one, well, anyway, we're going to move on because I won't talk too much about her. So in 1938, he has a series of strokes, I think 6 strokes, and has to retire. But he still keeps a cot in the back room at the gallery and goes in every day. Dorothy is still working there, helping out. She's still devoted to him, even though they're not lovers anymore. Georgia is going back and forth from New Mexico. Nancy and Beaumont Newhall, also terrific photographers, take over, kind of taking care of Alfred when she's gone. In 1940, Newhall, he was a archivist at the Museum of Modern Art for photography. He gets drafted in 1941, and Nancy takes over, doing what he had been doing at MoMA. So they're all very connected with the museum and also connected with taking care of Stieglitz. In 1946, he dies, and she's actually in New Mexico at the time. She flies back and sees him before he dies. Dorothy is there at his bedside. She throws Dorothy out and also throws Dorothy out of the gallery. Doesn't want her around anymore at all. But she stays for the next 3 years and settles his estate. And he has thousands and thousands and thousands of images, thousands of paintings, thousands of drawings. Because typically during a show, if an artist didn't sell anything, Stieglitz would buy a piece or 2, so the artist would have some money. It takes her 3 years to put everything together and make all the donations. She donates to the MoMA, the San Francisco MoMA, the Philadelphia Museum, the Chicago Art Institute, Fisk University, which is an all-Black university. So it's a kind of fitting end to his life, someone who is, I think, probably single-handedly more responsible for photography becoming an art form than anybody in history. There are some interesting things out there, lots and lots of stuff on Stieglitz to read if you're interested. There's a good presentation by Kirsten Hoving on YouTube about the early period, his early period with camera work. There's a complete, a beautiful book actually by Taschen. And then Stieglitz taking pictures, making painters, which is really readable. It's a small book, and it's quite marvelous. And then Alfred Stieglitz and his Artist by the Met, and that's a nice book too. So the next lecture is Thursday, July 2nd at 4 p.m. If you're interested, please just send an email. I'll be sending everybody emails about it. You can just respond that you'd like to do it. And then I'll give you the code as soon as we generate that. So thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your involvement and your continued support. And I hope to see all of you soon.
Terrific, terrific, Jerry.
Thank you very much.
Really terrific.
And I'll be staying online for the next 25 minutes if anybody has any questions. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Jerry.
Wonderful.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Jerry, can you,
Yeah, many thanks.
Jerry, can you tell us the name of the film that you thought was so good about Stieglitz?
Yeah, it's not great, but it's the best thing I could find. Let me see here how I can get to this. Wait a second. You cannot minimize Zoom when you're recording a meeting. I thought I stopped recording. Hold on, let me stop recording. Then I can do it.